Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review the Winchesters Season 1, Episode 5. So, here's one thing that I have to state before I get into other things about the Winchesters, like some network stuff. I'm also going to talk a little bit about Talkville, and then we'll get into this episode. One thing that I have to state is by the end of this episode, they go through the easiest route to point something out. Man, if they could have just gone on and acted it this way, to just be like, oh my god, paper tells me villain! Oh my god, paperwork! Wow! That was really just so well done by the end of this episode that they couldn't even be bothered. Paper tells me villain! Great! But so, let's get into these other things, and then we'll get into this episode. So, for some network stuff, come to find out Nexstar has bought out 75% of the CW, telling us that more than likely, most of the CW shows will probably get gutted. Having us also, through certain articles, which we can't confirm or deny whether or not that these are all legit or not, it seems that the Winchesters as well as Walker has already been told that their show is getting canceled, as well as also having Superman and Lois possibly going through their third season and then probably getting canceled after that. So whose line is it anyways? Is supposed to be canceled already or getting canceled or whichever. So there seems to just be a lot of stuff on the CW that more than likely will probably not go on to HBO Max. Because really, with HBO Max, I would just be like thumbing through all this stuff and just be like, no. Like, we're not going to continue any of this stuff. We're just going to go on our own thing and do our own stuff. So, sadly enough, probably none of these shows will probably get saved or go alternately elsewhere and be continued. And so really I could have already gotten that feeling through a lot of stuff anyways, considering how effort is to really be put forth in any of this stuff. So with that said, Tom Welling is to talk on Talkville and is to have gone through an episode called Crush, where Tom Welling states about the Winchester show that all that he says, really in my mind, is that the actors that are on the Winchester show are really young, and that's all he says. I could go on and really, pick through and really just narrow down exactly what Tom Welling is meaning by any of that, but I don't want to go on to do that because that just feels like putting words into someone's mouth. But I could probably figure out why he's stating any number of those things. Because one, his episode of the Winchesters has not aired yet. So it could just be a political thing to be like, yeah, I'm going to say nothing whatsoever about this show because I want my episode to air. Or really he can just go on and say, no, this is a really great show. And I would not state the same for myself, but Tom Welling has his own opinions. Plus, also, there's a lot of times where going through Talkville, it's like, yeah, I really liked this episode, and they hated it. And I was like, that's just my own, perspective of... Maybe I just have, man, I really wanted a vastly different episode, and they didn't, so it is what it is. But again, that's because who am I? So, with that said, let's go in and now talk about this Winchester's episode. So, we have a hefty amount of just convenience in this episode, because, in all honesty, we, of course, have Monroe, Ada, who is absent from last week's episode, for her to now have a much more prominent story in this episode. How convenient. But then we also, it seems, as we have ran out of stories for John to be involved in, and monsters for only John to fight, we now have to go on and have Mary have a story in this show. Wow, she actually has story? But here's the thing, though. We have Mary, who finally has a time to have a story that does not go on and focus on the one story that should have been told in this episode. And that's the thing that bugged the crap out of me. I'm like, here's the time that you could have taken to finally tell us what happened to Mary's cousin. But did you? No, you didn't. So, F off. But not only that, the biggest problem that I have with this episode is it feels like both Supernatural and Winchesters cannot get a Jinn right to save their lives. In all honesty, we have the Wes Craven movie, The Wishmaster, that goes on and tells us that a Jinn is an evil genie that grants wishes. And the only thing that I've seen before from Supernatural was the Jensen Ackles episode where he is to, I guess, have this alternate reality where Jensen's, or Dean's mother was still alive. Funny enough, they do that whole episode to just go on in the later part of the show, bring this character back anyways. How creative was that show? Not really all that creative. They just needed another foot soldier, and so bringing back Dean and Sam's mom was a thing to do. Because, of course, Jeffrey D. Morgan was also doing The Walking Dead, so why would he take his time to go in and being involved in the Supernatural show? He did come back for a cameo, but anyways, for one episode. But he was doing a lot of Walking Dead stuff. So, pushing on. So, speaking of Jinn, why couldn't they have gone on and had a Sandman come into this episode? A character that would have actually fit perfectly with this episode. Instead, they used a Jinn that goes on and is to be feeding off of people's dreams in this episode. And I'm like, why not use the Sandman? That would have worked great. Wonderful. A Netflix show even covered the Sandman. Was there an issue with having a Sandman being put into the show? The thing that would have made the most sense. We have a supernatural show that doesn't know supernatural things. And so with that said, let's go on into the just the overall just goofiness of this episode. There was some good things out of this. I liked what they did with Mary's backstory. But again, I still have that problem. So, with that said, let's go into that double 5 time territory. I know I didn't say much about this episode, but really, like, as much thinly as I can state for that teeing up thing, there isn't really much going on in this episode either. So with that said, let's go into it. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time is about that time you spoil this episode. So, in the beginning of this episode, we have John and Mary that are at Millie's garage. And here's the thing. So we would be, like, assuming that John from episodes before is talking about how he doesn't feel, like, good enough to be, like, the perfect hunter, and that he feels that, like, he should be, like, better trained and all this other kind of stuff, that he just doesn't feel that he's ready for this kind of thing, even though he has military training. What do they do in the beginning of this episode? We have John that is just pointing out motorcycle pieces to Mary and just being like, oh, hey, here's a cylinder, here's a engine, here's a this, here's a that. And Mary's like, oh, well, I already know what all this stuff is. And John is like, oh. Shouldn't have John firstly asked Mary? It's like, well, hey, like, do you know much about engines and stuff like that? And like Mary should have said, "Oh yeah, like I know a bunch," and then John would be like, "Good, so I don't have to, I don't have to go through all of this stuff." And so Mary goes on and is to state the reason why she, of course, is to have known all this stuff about cars and engines and motorcycles and whatever, because she is to state that she doesn't want to go on and jump onto a car or a motorcycle or something and not have the thing start. So I'm like, yeah, that makes all the sense in the world, because I don't know how many times you would go through any horror film and you'd have somebody like getting on a motorcycle and like, and like, oh my god, like the monster's coming. It's like, I'm trying to get it going, it won't start. And then they just have to like jump away from the car, the motorcycle, or they realize that the monster is already there and they're apt. So, so we really trying the story to make sense of why John and Mary are just in this garage and not thumbing through a bunch of supernatural books to learn more stuff. Because heaven forbid you do that. You just have Latia for that, right? The person who could have easily still gotten replaced by Monroe, because that's what happens in this episode. So we have John talking to Millie, and so we have them talking about the last Winchester episode and the whole shower demon debacle that John was fighting against by the end of the last episode. You know, the scene where John's just like, and his mother is just kind of coming in, just kind of taking care of him, and the dreaded demon shower. Yeah, wow, that was so scary. I was like, oh my god, that has got to be the worst monster I've ever seen in the show. What are you talking about? John was just in the shower, just sitting there, and he was sad. Because they don't really fight monsters on this show. They fight emotions. So, John is stating, yeah, like, it's nice to just kind of take a break away from fighting monsters, demons, you know, the family business that we should be doing. And so Millie's like, well, yeah, maybe you should really, like, talk to Mary and, like, tell her how you feel. And John's like, yeah, I don't really, like, I can't really figure her out yet. And so Marianne's walking in and talking to Millie. And so it seems that at some point that John is going to give Mary this motorcycle at some point in this story. Once, but they keep kind of talking about, like, John is stating that Mary should kind of work at this garage once Mary's done with hunting. When is that ever going to happen? When is that ever really going to go down? We have, like, the beginning of Supernatural where I don't think that they went on and were doing hunting, but still, there wasn't much of a story enough to really convince us, because, like, we could just state that Mary's looking after her child, and John, of course, was tired. Anyways, so let's go on. So we have Mary that is to come up with the conclusion of a case that has something to do with a consulman, because, of course, the real legit opening of this episode deals with the consulman, and that's what I wanted to kind of, like, not exactly get to right away. So let's get to that now. In the opening of this episode, which I think was probably the best thing about this episode, but because it shows us, like, oh wow, they're doing dream sequences. Like, that seems cool, but of course, poor execution as per always for any number of these things, so they had a good idea there, but so Gordon Baxter is to be this consulman who is to be at his office, and he is just running around. We all of a sudden have his assistant going on and telling him what he is scheduled next to do, but Baxter is just kind of really not listening to her. He's still just running all over the place because it seems that he is running away from something. that we don't go on and see what it is. And I'm like, yeah, like classic Supernatural. If you go on and watch the first like werewolf episode of Supernatural, you have a person kind of running from something, kind of looking back like, and then you never really see the werewolf. And then they never go on and actually do werewolves because they don't have the real legitimate money to do any of that. So you just get like fangs and all kinds of stuff. But this show has more money, right? Maybe not always. So Gordon, it seems, is to be kind of looking back like, and then all of a sudden we find out he's waking up from a dream. And so once we find that Baxter seems to be sleeping in his office consistently, and so Gordon's assistant Patty is coming in and telling him what his schedule is. We have Gordon that all of a sudden is to get up and like, okay, yeah. And all of a sudden he, frickin' falls to the ground and he is now dead. His brain is Swiss cheese. So, we then go on to have the Scooby-Doo gang with Monroe. We forget about her in the last week's, or the last episode, but we remember her here now. So she's back with a Scooby-Doo gang. So we have everybody going on and wearing their councilman pins as if he's still alive. And so I guess we're having the Scooby-Doo gang portray as councilman supporters, and it feels like they've known this guy forever, bizarrely. And so we have Patty, who goes on to state that what the councilman has been doing until he was to die. She goes on and states how like he was having nightmares and he was sleeping in his office more and more, and like it got to the point to where like she then found him dead. So we have, of course, we have like Carlos who's stating like, well, like that doesn't seem like the councilman that we know, because yeah, you know him so well, you know him inside and out. And Patty's like, well, yeah, like that. I'm just telling you, like what I've been experiencing until he died. So like, okay, all right, like so. Immediately, the group is to walk out, and they're like, okay, well, obviously this is a djinn. This is going to be the most accurate assumption that they can go on and make through every single one of these episodes. It's gotta be the djinn, right? Because if I've heard about djinns, like, I know that djinns are to go on and mess with people's dreams. Something that you would probably have to go on and really have researched, but these people just know right away. Because if anybody is to know about djinns, they know that they're evil genies, and that's about it. That they grant people wishes that don't go quite that well. But it seems weirdly these people know so much about djinns, and I'm like, how? Because story would tell you to, that they would have to know this, miraculously. So, we have to go on and find this djinn. And so they just go through a random warehouse. The one warehouse that they go on and look for this guy in. And Carlos is stating how every warehouse they seem to go in is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's like, well, yeah, because you guys need to find just warehouses to do all these scenes in. Because how many warehouses have they done throughout the show now within 5 episodes? It seems like every episode they have a warehouse to do something in. So we go on to make our way into this warehouse, and they conveniently end up finding the djinn there. And so they're trying to chase this djinn down, and come to find out the one djinn they end up finding is to actually be tied to Monroe. Because of course, Monroe is to state to the Scooby Gang that this guy is to be her son, who is Tony. So now Monroe has to go on and give us a backstory of her character because she was gone the previous episode. So Monroe goes on and states that she, of course, was to be all well and knowing of the supernatural world, but she just fell in love with the guy she fell in love with, who just so happened to be a djinn. Come to find out, the cravings for this djinn was to become too much, and hunters were to come in and kill him off. But Monroe was to want to keep this baby and hope that maybe her son would not go on and become a djinn and maybe just become like 100% human. But come to find out that was not the case. So Tony ends up becoming half djinn, and so we find out it's like, okay, so can he still eat burgers then? Can he, like, does he only have to do like half as much as any other djinn, or is he just like full djinn and he just has to go on and not grant any wishes, but bizarrely go through people's dreams and help them out and just kind of feed on them a little bit, just nibble a little bit, you know what I'm saying? So we get that story, and I was like, okay, that's actually cool. But evidently, I'm still in my mind thinking, like, well, there has to have been a reason why Monroe wasn't in this show, the previous episode whatsoever, to now have this. So that bugs me. How this show doesn't feel all that random. Because of course it doesn't. So we go on to have Monroe and Carlos kind of stake out this warehouse again, hoping that Monroe will go on and find her son and talk to him. So while that's going on, we have John and Mary that are wanting to assess whether or not that the djinn is really going on and doing this, or maybe something else is. So John, of course, is to go on and meet up with Betty. And so John ends up talking to Betty and is to bring her her favorite meal from some restaurant somewhere. And we go on to find out that this is to not be the only victim that has had his brain Swiss cheesed. It seems that there are 2 other victims. So there is to be like a string of people who are to go on and fall to the same problem. And John is to go on and talk to Betty. And it really doesn't feel like he went to really talk to her to like play catch up. If anything, he really just went to her to ask her about these cases. And if I were to have been Betty, I would have been like, wow, like he really doesn't give a shit about me anymore. Like, and the thing of it is that, like, maybe John should have really just come clean to Betty and told her the truth. But Betty conveniently also is to need to have to go on to take on a shift. And so Betty tells John that. So there's a lot of convenience again with this scene where Betty really should have just jumped on John a bit like, well, hey, like, why are you asking me these questions? Like, I'm not going to leave here until you tell me the true answer and not make something up, because I can tell when you lie. Boom, there we go. That would have been like an amazing thing, but they didn't write that in there. But yeah. You would have thought with these, because we even have Millie that is to state that that John seems to be like latching on to Mary like he did with Betty, and probably telling us that John at some point is going to be with Mary and marry Mary, but who knows? With the way that the show will probably end without really going it, maybe they're going to do the whole wedding thing by the end of the by the end of the season, because that should just be the way to end this show, because that would obviously be the goofy thing to do. What if Sam and Dean show up on the last season finale to go to their parents' wedding? Wouldn't that be funny? but with the way that we're probably seeing this show end anyways, I think having Sam and Dean on one of these episodes would just be like a way to just be like, well, yeah, the show is ending, but hey, F it, like, what can we do? So, with that said, uh, we we go on into uh, having Monroe and Carlos doing this stakeout, and we have Monroe that ends up connecting with Tony, and she ends up giving him this necklace. And so Monroe goes on to talk to Tony, and Tony is to state that it's like, well, yeah, like, you didn't tell me about me being a djinn, you hid this from me. And Tony was to state, like, who he's gone on and helped. That, yeah, he might have eaten a little bit of them, but, like, the only thing that he's ever caused at the worst case is to be a headache. So Tony has gone on and kind of fed off of people's dreams, but nothing so severe as killing anybody off, just kind of taking a little bit of something. But yeah, so we have Monroe, who is to believe her son. And so, come to find out, we end up finding out anyways that whenever somebody is to go on and get their, like, brain drained, we find out that there has to be some markings that a djinn would never do anyways. So instead we come to find out that really, like, this is to not be a djinn whatsoever. So instead also Tony is to tell Monroe that he had found out from other people in their dreams that they had actually been attacked by some bug. So that is to tell us that the Akrita were to actually be the victims of all these people who had died. That we really had Tony who was trying to save these people, but couldn't be able to fight off the Akrita. So we go on to have the Scooby Gang that is to try and go on and find the next possible victim, which is to be a guy named Derek Fisher. So we have the Scooby Gang making their way to this place, and they go on to talk to Derek Fisher. And what they state is like, well, hey, like, we need you to go on and evacuate. Carlos states this. We need you to go on and evacuate this place because this building is obviously not up to code, and, like, we were sent here by this by whoever to go on and get you out of here. So Derek is like, well, like, that's interesting because I was to go on and be sent by the company that I'm involved in because this building isn't up to code. So what other story do you got for me? Whatever, like, what can you tell me here? So realizing that they have been had, it's kind of like the Ghostbusters 2 scenario where the guys are drilling into the sewer, and we of course have the cops who's like, why are you cutting? And the guys are like, well, like we're putting phone lines over here. It's like, no, like, the phone lines are over there. Like, why are you cutting? And so it's like, whoops. It's like, why didn't you tell me the phone lines were over there? Like, da-da-da-da. So, yeah, like, that whole scene of the Ghostbusters in their construction outfits, and eventually just drilling to find out that the sewer is to have slime in it. Mood slime. So, as if we're going to have mood rings next in the third film, which we never got. So, because I just saw like a Quantum Leap episode where they talked about mood rings, so that's why I thought I would mention that. So, how is it that we didn't have mood rings in this show? It's a 70s show. Have mood rings. Come on. Come on, show. Anyways. So, Derek is to obviously realize that he can't trust these people, but then we have the Akrita come bugging in, and so we have this one monstrous thing that is to be an Akrita that I guess decently has special effects with it. I could just state that like they didn't do like a close up of this thing, like it's looked good enough. So we have the Krita that goes on and is to run off and ends up infecting not Derek Fisher, but instead was to go on and infect Mary. We have Derek then it's mentioning to the guys like, what is that? And we have Carlos who is to say it's like, well, it's a big cockroach or whatever. They could have made the Ghostbuster reference. It's like, well, hey, somebody saw a big cockroach up on 12. Must have been some cockroach. But no, they don't go that route. So the guy runs off, and so Mary ends up falling to the ground. Ugh, I'm infected by the Akrita. So we now have to go on and find Tony yet again, because Monroe is realizing that Tony had bus tickets, and Monroe had talked to Tony while she was asleep, because Tony was talking to Monroe while she was dreaming, and that's how Carlos and Monroe figured out what was going on with Tony. So Monroe goes to this bus, finds Tony, luckily, and we have Monroe trying to convince Tony that Monroe wants Tony to do something good with his ability, and Monroe is just wanting Tony to help her to go on and maybe like have a friend, because when really looking at it, if Tony goes on and is to befriend hunters, then maybe Tony will forever go on and be safe, because it's like, well, hey, like I know these hunters, like call them up and they'll tell me that, or they'll tell you that I'm good, like that I worked with them in the past, and maybe he'll get scot-free. Or I'm assuming maybe in other episodes they'll probably bring him back to maybe kind of have him into the story more somehow. I don't know. Like they could do some. They had a second season. I'm sure they would just bring that character back, but they're not going to. So that is what it is. So Monroe brings Tony to the Men of Letters headquarters. So they now have to go on and tie up Mary because she might be having night terrors and might be smacking people. I'm gonna start smacking people, so you better tie me up into this chair. Tie me up really good. Feels like I want to so badly just to quote that one lemonade thing from The Walking Dead, where Negan goes on and says, like, make it good. That's what I want to do for this show, is just like every episode just state, like, why can't you just make it good? Because that's what I want to say. So Mary is going to go into her dream coma, and so we have Tony that's like, well, hey, I need a volunteer, and I need to also, like, I need to go under. So we have Carlos who makes the joke of like, well, what are you, a magician? And Tony's like, well, from what I'm about to do, like, we might need that just as well. So, and I thought the whole magician line was actually pretty good. I thought that was a funny joke. So we, of course, have John, who's like, well, obviously I'm going to volunteer because poster guy, and John needs something to do because he wasn't in enough of this episode. And it wasn't going to be Carlos because it just wasn't going to be. Surprisingly. I thought it was going to be Carlos. So, or I thought it was going to be Latia, the person that has nothing to have gone on and really done in this episode. But it's still John. So, we have, of course, John who has to hold Mary's hand. And so Tony is telling everybody that when he's going to go on and touch Mary, he's going to go into the dream world. He's going to be out. But he also needs someone to do something with John. And John's like, what does that mean? And Carlos punches him in the face and knocks him out. So you would have thought when John wakes up, he would have been like, Mother, you broke my nose. Or something along those lines of like, oh my God, like that freaking hurt. No. So we have John that goes into the dream world. And so John somehow immediately meets with Mary and explains her what's all going on. It's like, hey, Tony's here and we're going to go and try to help you, like, figure out what's going on here. But the funny thing is, in this dream world, Tony does not exist. Tony is gone. So it's just Mary and John figuring things out. So we go into these doors that lead into Mary's mind. And you would have thought by the real, like, aftermath of this thing, we'd have had John who told Mary, it's like, you know what, after finally being inside your head, like, I feel like I've gotten to know you, and you know what, like, I want to state now that you and me love. But no, we don't. It almost gets to that point of Mary going on and like, what do you want to say, John? And John's like, no. Because once these two get together, that's when the show ends. That's when people stop caring. So we have John and Mary, and they go through one door that is to have this flashback of young Mary going on and having to kill a kid named Jacob, who I guess was a lichen or a werewolf. And so come to find out, Mary was to just go on and kill a werewolf no matter like who she thought it was or whatever. And come to find out, but I'm like, also like, wait a minute, if you've ever seen werewolves or lichens in this show, you realize that you could easily identify who that is because they don't have hair. They don't have... So, again, they do another werewolf character dirty in this show. But, bizarrely enough, Mary could not identify what a werewolf looks like, which is so dumb to me. Because in my brain, I'm like, they don't have huge mounds of hair. Anyways. So, Mary kills Jacob, and we have John going like, oh my God, like, you were, like, traumatized as a young kid. And so now I can understand maybe why, like, Mary is so guarded, or maybe why Mary is so tough the way she is. Or maybe why she goes on and doesn't really much exist on this show, because she has been so traumatized from the past. So we then move on to The Memory of Mary number 2, which of course is to give us the thumbnail for this episode. And the only reason why that is because, in all actuality, I was to try to go on and take multiple pictures of this episode, but for how limited my Wi-Fi is not to exist, and also how very limited my internet for my cell phone to be tethered to this thing is not working out that well right now, I was to go on and be lucky that I got any kind of thumbnail for this episode. It just was really like, man, I hope I can do some thumbnails and something for today, because man, was I just getting really, I was getting really worried. Plus, that also is going to continue to have me worried about, like, can I put out a video today? Who knows? We'll figure that out by when this goes out. So we have Mary that goes into this other room, and this, of course, is have like, uh, this is Mary's room. Stay out, or don't come in. So they end up going to this room because John is to break the door down. And Mary is actually very hesitant about going into this room. And I'm like, what? Does it have anything to do with your cousin? No, it doesn't. So who cares? So come to find out, the image in this room of which that we see is that Mary is holding this knife in her bed. I'm like, wow, this seems like a very horrific, traumatizing moment. But so we find out in this story that Mary is to state that this is a memory of her getting a knife when she was a very young kid, realizing that she was going to have to grow up very quickly. So we have John that is to tell Mary, it's like, well, like, obviously you can go on and talk to your younger self. So, like, tell her exactly what it is that you would have liked to have heard when you were a younger kid dealing with this problem. And to me, like, this just comes off as like Mary stating, it's like, well, hey, like, it's okay to be afraid, like, it's okay to be scared, and like, you're a little kid, so it makes all the sense in the world. But I'm paraphrasing hugely what Mary really says, but the big point is for her to state that, like, it's okay to be scared. But also, they should have used the Ghostbusters line, if you aren't afraid, it can't hurt you. But again, monsters still exist. But also, Mary was to state to John that her parents were to tell her at a very young age that everything that was to really bump in the night, all those things were to really be true. The Booger Man and every bit of that was all true, that they actually really do exist. Instead of having John having blissful ignorance for I don't know how long of his life, that the boogeyman does not really exist. And he can enjoy all the scary movies because they are real things. So we have Mary that is to sit down, talk to her younger self, and it seems that her younger self is like, like, that was nice. Like, that was... so we have Mary's younger self that kind of pulls away this pillow to show Mary what she's going to have to go on and destroy, that looks just like joints, weirdly. Like a stack full of joints. But all of them were supposed to, like, metaphorically tie into the spikes that the Akrita kind of put into Mary's brain, because Tony states, is like, well, like the Akrita, like, things are really going in way further than just kind of poking into parts of this person's body. It's going really further into the brain. So we also, when Mary and John were going into that other image of Mary killing Jacob, like, we had younger Mary who was a state to Mary and John. It's like, well, like, the things that you're looking for are not in here, so go somewhere else. So we have Mary that goes on and takes this knife and smashes the Akrita spikes. And so she wakes up with green eyes as if she was the Incredible Hulk. And she goes on to, of course, wake up. Everyone else does. And then they're like, what a relief it is. So we have Tony, who is to still want to leave. And so Monroe is like, well, hey, like, wherever you're going, can I drive you? And so I guess Monroe is going to be absent for another week of this show. We also have Latia, who is looking up and down at Tony and be like, I want me some of that. And we have Tony, who says to Latia, it's like, well, hey, can I write you? And so is that how they're going to possibly work him back into the story, to just be like, oh yeah, like, he hasn't wrote me in a week, and I think he might be dead. Let's try and find him. I don't know. But so Tony is to mention, it's like, well, hey, like, I'm sorry I can't be more help with this Akrita threat, and Moreau's like, no, it's okay because like we have enough people in this cast already. That's what she should have said. So Tony drives off, and so by the end of this episode, we again have John and Mary back at the garage, and John, of course, needed a project to kind of eat up some time, and that, of course, was to be this motorcycle. So John, it seems, was to have gotten it fixed, and so John was to say to Mary that he really needs to go on and like tell Mary something. And Mary's like, well, okay, John, what could it be? And so John goes and it seems like he's leading up to something big, and Mary's like, huh? And then John just states, it's like, oh, okay, well, like, instead of me just saying that I love you, instead I'm going to state that, like, after you're done quitting being a hunter, you can have this motorcycle and you can drive it whenever you want. And so Mary's like, okay, but that wasn't obviously the thing that he was going to state here. And so with that said, also, we have another thing going on. So since it seems that they are to find an Akrita in this town, they're now starting to realize that there might have been a way to track down the Akrita. We also have Tony that tells Latia before he leaves with Monroe. Tony states that that obviously he's kind of heard around that the Krita are gathering certain rare monster essences. And Lottie is like, oh, so we're almost helping the Akrita by killing all these monsters, and we didn't even realize it. And Tony's like, yeah, like that's why they're all here, so that way you can go on and kill them all off. And you're kind of helping the Akrita gathering all these essences. And so maybe all of the Winchesters are going to have to go on and collect all these essences themselves. And maybe they're going to go to have them be using these essences against the Akrita. Maybe it's going to be just like the one Power Ranger season, the Beast Morpher season. Or maybe... no. Maybe it's the... whatever the Dino one is. Oh my god. There's one where they have these things called Sporex, and I think that's the most recent season. That's Dino Fury, where we have the villains that are capturing all these Sporex. And so it's basically so much about this show now is just really Power Rangers in a lot of ways. It's the later seasons of Power Rangers. How do I know about all these Power Rangers seasons? Because I've watched most of them, sadly enough. But also I would watch this show, so what's the big difference? But anyways, so yeah, I'm going to get out of here because I realized that this review is almost over the minutes of this show, but it's once a week, so I could care less. Plus, this show is probably also going to get canceled, so one thing that I'll end up on, we have, of course, the Scooby Gang that is to be nearby all these papers that state to us about Roxanne. And we have John who's thinking like, well, I think there's some monster frequency that is like radio wave related. And so come to find out the only DJ in town is to be a woman named Roxanne. So they just point at these papers and like, oh my god, it must be Roxanne. So the next thing we end up seeing is Roxanne, who is the villain, the big bad DJ. And we go on to, of course, have her assistant that goes on to walk in there and is stating, it's like, well, like he basically almost states like the Scooby-Doo line when they capture the kids, or the monster ends up getting captured by the end of the episode. It's like, well, we would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for those meddling kids. It feels like this guy goes on and states the same statement where it's like, well, yeah, like we would be so much more well off if it wasn't for these hunters. And Roxanne is just like, well, like, we're going to figure something out. Like, we're going to come up with something. So more than likely, I'm sure, like, the Accretor is just going to be such a big, huge, massive threat through every single one of these rest of these episodes, right? Sure they will. Sure they will. I doubt we'll probably even remember that they're on the show. And then by the season finale, it's like, hey, we're here again. We're the Accretor. Isn't that great? So, yeah, I don't have a lot of faith in this show. Here's the thing, like, I'm wondering if their mid-season is going to happen anytime soon, because they already took a break last week. So I'm wondering, why did they have to take a break for to put out a just kind of meh episode? Wow. So that's it. I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.